So welcome to this panel on the topic of immigration and the left, the night before a historic election. Probably a lot more tension in this than there was in the baseball game last week. I'm Joseph Estes. I'm a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society, organization that hosts a discussion on leftist politics. We seek to clarify political issues on the left through a discussion, through a publication of the Platypus Review, which is available for free outside, which brings together not only transcripts of panels like this one, but also articles and interviews from various activists, thinkers, sectarians, and liberals, whatever anybody considers himself on the left is open to participate in that discussion we hold in print. And we also hold a reading group here on campus on the history of the left and the history of Marxism, meeting, I'm forgetting now, Tuesday nights,
5 to 8.
5 to 8.
Stevenson Hall.
In Stevenson Hall. And then you have coffee breaks on Wednesdays.
At 3.
3 p.m.
Student Center East.
Behind the Dunkin' Donuts. So we're gonna, I'm gonna read out introductions for the readers, for the speakers, and the panel description, just to give a quick refresher on what we're here to discuss tonight. Panel description reads as follows: Neoliberalism, as the current organization of capitalism, promised to overcome the crisis of the Keynesian-Fordist states through the attainment of a free, cosmopolitan society. Yet the weight of national borders continues to be felt. While capital can easily move to a home where it is profitable, workers find their movement more stifled. From Brexit to the US presidential elections, immigration has become unavoidable in political discourse. Some politicians have promised comprehensive immigration reform, while others have considered the undocumented culpable for the decline of the nation's economy and sovereignty. In each case, a crisis of neoliberalism is registered, but what is the meaning of the question to the left and its attempts to change the world? Famously, the Communist Manifesto says, "The working men have no country." The incessant drive to realize profit sends capital all over the world, uprooting established relations and dynamizing the global economy. Workers are forced to consider themselves internationally in the fight against capital. Further, immigration might even centralize the gravediggers of capitalism. However, if this process is not grasped by the workers, it offers an opportunity for the capitalists to secure their reign. The precarity of immigrants can be exploited by the ruling class to split the proletariat and contain their political struggle. That is, unless there is a left to lead. We had 3 questions to help orient the panelists' opening remarks. How has the left approached the question of immigration historically, and what opportunities exist in the immigrants' right movements today for a renewed emancipatory politics? How is immigration related to other demands made by the left? What role can left organizations, civil and or political, play in immigration politics? To my immediate left, we have our first speaker, Jorge Mujica, who he was born in Mexico City and participated in several popular movements in Mexico until he moved to the United States in 1987. As a journalist, he worked for several Spanish-language newspapers, for the Spanish TV stations Univision and Telemundo, and won 2 first-place awards by the National Association of Hispanic Publishers. As an activist, Jorge has collaborated with many labor unions in organizing the election with election campaigns, picket lines, and strikes, and is a member of several community organizations dealing with Mexico-USA relations, from remittances to the right to vote from abroad. He was one of 3 conveners of the historic immigrant right marches in Chicago in 2006, and ran for U.S. Congress in 2009, representing the immigration movement in the electoral arena. Last year, he ran for alderman in Chicago's 25th ward as the figurehead of the Chicago Socialist Campaign. Currently serving as lead strategic campaigns organizer for Rise Chicago, a nonprofit organization addressing the needs of low-wage workers, particularly stolen wages. Next to him, we have Ralph Cintron, who has a joint appointment in Latin American and Latino Studies and English here at UIC. For LALS, he has been teaching most recently courses on global immigration and the undocumented. For English, he teaches a range of courses in rhetorical theory. His books, Angels Towns, General Ways, Gang Life, and Rhetorics of the Everyday, won honorable mention for the Victor Turner Prize from the American Anthropological Association. His most recent publication in 2015, Culture, Catastrophe plus Rhetoric, The Texture of Political Action, is a co-edited volume that addresses the so-called catastrophe as global trope. He is close to completing a manuscript titled Democracy as Fetish, Fieldwork, Rhetoric, and Oligarchic Condition. At one point or another, he has been a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow and a Fulbright Scholar. And finally, Professor Jacqueline Stevens conducts research on political theories and practices of membership since antiquity. Her current studies of deportation law enforcement engage European fantasies of conquest in the 12th to 17th centuries, as well as the quotidian of government documents revealing contemporary illegalities, including practices resulting in the unlawful deportation of United States citizens from the United States. Her research on deportations has been the basis for successful lawsuits challenging government misconduct. She received her PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley in '93, and graduated Phi Beta Kappa with the highest honors from Smith College. Professor Stevens' work has appeared in Political Theory, the American Political Science Review, the Journal of Political Philosophy, Social Text, Third World Quarterly, and many other scholarly venues, as well as the Nation magazine and the New York Times. Reports on her work on ICE and private prison misconduct have appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Times, NPR, CNN, and numerous other venues. So we're going to go ahead, and each speaker is going to have about 8 minutes to give opening remarks. We're going to follow that with 2 to 4 minutes of responses from each of the speakers, and then we're going to open it up to a series of questions from our audience. You want to take it off?
Okay, sure, why not? 8 minutes is obviously insufficient, absolutely, to talk about immigration. This is the most complicated issue I know of. And, you know, there may be global warming and ecology and animal rights, but immigration takes the lead. It's the most complicated issue I know. Let me put it this way. I think immigration movement is not a revolutionary movement, is not a movement leading to any profound change as we know it. The so-called immigration movement is dominated basically by big, huge organizations which have money, structure, and basically are on the good side of the Democratic Party in the United States. I'm not talking about the debate, because you know we have the extreme right, the Tea Party, the Minuteman, and the Donald Trump, which is not a novelty. You know, Donald Trump only reflects what this society is all about: racism, proto-fascism, discrimination, rampant incarceration, and whatnot. But also the Democratic Party plays into the role. I mean, 3 million people deported in the last 8 years is a whole lot. Basically, Donald Trump is threatening us with reality. I think that's what Donald Trump is doing. I mean, he couldn't do pretty much, really, I think, many more things than what the Obama administration has done. But these big, huge corporations, I'm talking about non-profits of the likes of We Are America, Firm, the National Council of La Raza, whose one big contributor is the U.S. Army, and the other one is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They are the dominant figure in this so-called immigration movement. Obviously, there's no left there to be found. Then there's another category, another echelon, which is the local organizations, also structured, also more or less without money, all of them non-profits, but they are part of the corporate non-profit, which in the end also obey the directions of the Democratic Party. When the Democratic Party said, do not march in 2007, this organization said, do not march. And we only came out on May Day in 2007 because there was a raid in Little Village at the discount mall 1 week before May Day, and that prompted 250,000 people to march in the city of Chicago. Without that raid, there wouldn't have been, any major demonstration, probably 10 or 15,000 people. But those are the local structures in a vertical line. Then we have the disgruntled activists, which are not left either, in which I would position the dreamers, the young people who started fighting and actually in opposition to the Democratic Party, obviously to the Republican Party. They even took legislative offices, including Democratic Party senators and congressmen. They picketed Luis Gutierrez, who's supposed to be the champion of immigration in the House of Representatives. This is a faction of people who became incredibly disenchanted with the other structures and organizations in this so-called immigration movement. And then at the end, we have small groupings of activists, who do and insist and go over and over and over about the immigration issue and try to present a different perspective. Now, what this perspective may be? Well, unfortunately, the public discourse, as Hillary Clinton would say, is one and the public conversation is the other one. Since this is a public forum, I would say revolution, 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 but that's not true. Even in the left, the discussion is what kind of legislative actions may be taken in order to solve a minimal administrative problem, which is the amount of visas given to international workers, which is the designation I rather prefer instead of immigrants or undocumented immigrants or whatever. To me, it's international workers. In 2006, when the Sensenbrenner legislation came up criminalizing, or with the intent of criminalizing everybody, the big slogan on the side of the marches was, I am not a criminal, I am a worker. We are not criminals, we are workers. It didn't say, we are not criminals, we are students. It didn't say, we are not criminals, we are fathers and mothers. It didn't say, we are not criminals, we are, just families. It particularly stressed, and this was a popular slogan, it wasn't made up by any leadership, we are not criminals, we are workers. And that's what I think the left has tried to put at the center of the immigration debate and the immigration reality. I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning today because I'm helping in my job. I work for a worker center. We support workers' struggles, and we have a group of 100 workers who are being dismissed by a company under the argument of not having immigration papers in the middle of a union election process. The elections are scheduled for November 18, and today the factory locked them out, locked out 90-something workers or something like that. So what's the problem and what's the solution here? Well, obviously, in the practical sense, it's papers. What people need, what people want to be recognized as is workers. Let us work, because we came to this country to work. And that's it. That's the end of it. If Hillary Clinton, negotiated with the Tea Party tomorrow, just give papers to these people, not citizenship, not path to citizenship, nothing, just give them papers to work, everybody would be happy in the immigrant community. Now, on the other side of this, we assume that immigrants are international workers, and regardless the status they have, and regardless whether you have papers or you don't, you are just a worker, pretty much. And so you have to be assumed, and you have to assume yourself as working class. Because, and the most beautiful of the struggles I participate in is the fight for 15, because the fact of being a citizen or being an undocumented worker doesn't make a shit of difference when you're paid minimum wage to work at a McDonald's. You know, when your wages are stolen, whether you are a US citizen or not, whether you are a legal permanent resident or not, you know, you are a minimum wage worker still. You are still a minimum wage worker, and you know, you may change your name, you may change your immigration status, you may change anything you want, but your working conditions are not going to change. Yeah, after the so-called amnesty of 1886, according to some studies, only 15% of the people who got granted legalization improved their working conditions. It may seem a lot, you know, well, each person counts, and each individual and each family, but 15% is like this percent, meaning 85% of the people who went from being documented to be legal permanent residents did not improve their living conditions. Because with the papers, there is no wage increase, because with the papers, there is no improvement in housing, transportation, or better schools, public schools, or anything else. I mean, the trends that affect every poor US citizen, every worker in the United States, are conditions that affect immigrant workers, international workers. Poor neighborhood, meaning poor transportation, meaning poor schooling, poor public schooling, and so on and on and on. So that's pretty much the perspective we are trying to hold and push for. You know, first and foremost, international workers are exactly that. Workers, people who want to work. They will be satisfied if they obtain a paper that allows them to work in peace, travel back and forth the border, and that would be the end of it. Our role, I think, as the left, is to go beyond and say, yeah, you know, it's true. Your citizenship status, eventual citizenship status, is not going to change your shitty working conditions. And that's pretty much what I think.
Yeah. Let me say that before I launch into anything, I do a lot of ethnographic field work. So I've spent a lot of time with undocumented workers, not to the extent that Jorge has, but talking to them. And so on. My first deeper involvement occurred in the 2006 marches with Vida Arellano. And watching that evolve, and so on. And then thinking about, because I do field work on the north side around Humboldt Park, Puerto Ricans primarily, Jorge knows all that. And it was in those tensions between Puerto Ricans and Mexicans, which I thought was very, very interesting. And then over time, I gradually became, at least ethnographically, interested in things like affordable housing, which is, in one sense, a really underpinning kind of reality for everyone, it seems to me. So anyway, I wanted to preface that even though I'm going to have some rather abstract readings of immigration, particularly at a global level, I wanted to stress the fact that it begins, or has begun, within this fieldwork set of experiences. So one of the things that I think that the blurb and perhaps the questions have it wrong, I'm not even too sure we know what neoliberalism means, for instance. It's not a term that I particularly want to subscribe to, that I particularly want to mobilize. It's unclear to me what it specifically refers to. It refers to a lot of things. I'm very familiar with some of the very good work that wants to think of neoliberalism as a pretty strong causal force for increasing immigration issues, undocumented and so on. For instance, NAFTA as one kind of example, and that makes good sense in that particular instance, it seems to me. But in so many other instances, I'm not too sure why we want to even hang on to a word like neoliberalism. I'm sure that there are many in the room that probably would disagree with me. Let me frame it this way. And I'm thinking rather particularly of an article by William Walters that makes, to my mind, a fairly strong case. History of things like deportation, exile, population transfer. These are really ancient practices. They're practices which seem to be about sovereign power, sovereign authority, wherever the sovereign might be. Is the sovereign a king? Is the sovereign of the nation state? The sovereign of the people? Doesn't make a damn bit of difference. They're all invested in things like deportation, exile, population transfer, historically. So does the term neoliberalism offer us a particular kind of wedge which really gets us somewhere? To a certain extent, maybe, maybe not. Let's go to one of the interesting moments in English history, 1662 Poor Laws, for instance, as they run into the next century. And European poor laws, not just England, but expanded through different parts of Europe as well. The problem there was a labor, but in this case, not crossing national boundaries, crossing parish boundaries. So what is it that's being protected? Well, you have your local labor force, you have your local economy, you have your local elites, etc. And if you have the neighboring labor force from the neighboring parish moving in, it causes dislodgement. So there is deportation, there is detainment, there are all of the sorts of practices that we're now complaining about at a global level are already well in place, long before we can have this term neoliberalism. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make. There's something fundamental about, let's call it a politics of movement versus a kind of a politics of stasis. I don't know what else to call it, stasis. Jackie, I think, has done some really exceptional work around the nation state, that the nation state is a kind of like a static entity that wants to maintain certain kinds of stabilities. What are these stabilities? Well, stabilities of people, so to speak, stabilities of economy, stabilities of borders, etc. And politics of movement, which try to keep crossing against these politics of stases or politics of stabilities. So we've had a long human history of these kinds of essential things. So what is deportation? It's just one example. Well, if we think that essentially what we have managed to do is to organize the world's population into their discrete places, into their discrete peoples, governed by their discrete sovereigns, then deportation is really nothing more than returning people to their rightful sovereign. That is a peculiar way to think about deportation. But that is a history. That's a history of what it has been. In the parish of the poor laws, it's the local sovereign who's returning populations back to their rightful parishes in some fashion in order to maintain the stability of the overall system. So the question, a question I'm trying to push on, which is a little different from Jorge's, is wondering about neoliberalism as an adequate kind of category, wondering about the nation state as a kind of like an essential problem whether we have a neoliberal state or a Keynesian state, they're both going to do the same. It doesn't make any difference. They're still going to have more, they're still going to want to regulate labor in some fashion or another. I don't have any really good answer to this. I have become interested over the last few years in how would I call it? The nomosphere. By that I mean the kind of legal global system that the global sphere operates under. Got it. And within that system, what has really interested me a lot are property rights. And I'm thinking very particularly of customary property rights. Let's go to Borneo just for a second, in which native populations customarily have owned forested lands and have survived through those kinds of needs. The state, in the name of its ownership, it owns the land, right? Because if you don't have private property rights that have emerged from customary rights, then the state is considered to be the owner. Then the state begins to sell off or lease to, in the case of Borneo, this is the work of Anna Singh in Friction, by the way. In the case of Borneo, to Japanese lumber companies who are interested in making plywoods. And so now they have the right over the land, which means that the people are being displaced. They have lost their place, what they consider to be their customary rights. They have lost it to a kind of a world system of global property rights. So that has really kind of interested me considerably. When we look at indigenous populations and other parts of the world, to what extent is this vast shift going on between customary property rights into larger private property landholdings, first on the part of the state, then on the part of private property companies and so on. Now it looks like neoliberalism, but then I would say property rights is at the core of neoliberalism. And I would like to say, let's start there with ownership and possession, and consider who is owning and who is possessing, and on what basis do we consider these ownerships and possession? And on what basis does that become a right to expel the population, and therefore they are now in movement, and then they get deported back. They no longer have a place to move to. But anyway, I think that's a larger system I was thinking about.
Yeah.
So this is very enjoyable for me to listen to these responses to the question about immigration politics historically and the neoliberalism. And I think that my contribution to this is complementary to what you guys are up to. I share with Jorge a concern that the immigration movements that we see right now are not very radical at all, and also agree with Ralph's criticisms of the concept of neoliberalism. And what I wanted to talk about a little bit is to think about why we have this, as the left, and some kind of engagement and investment in the concept of neoliberalism, and where that comes from and what an alternative might look like. And so I think pretty obviously it comes from Marx and this idea that the basis of economic inequality has to do with the relation to the means of production and the discourses that are generated there from, and then we were part of this society where market values supposedly eclipse everything, and that explains why we're immobilized as a population, unable to challenge in any effective way through our political institutions economic inequality. Marx has this perspective in part, or largely because he sees in the development of capitalism the eclipsing of the centrality of the state to the constitution of inequality. So under feudalism, the state is establishing the status relationships that denote ownership of land, right? So it comes from the king, and then people have different prerogatives to own the land based on that. And with the development of new technologies, those kinds of prerogatives from political society are attenuated and eclipsed by the market, and who owns the means of production, right? So one symptom of Marx developing this argument is in his writings in the 1840s, in the early 1840s, where he uses the concept of Stand, the word Stand, to characterize what gets translated as class. And it's also the word that's used as for state. So Hegel is the person that Marx identifies as coming up with this theory that still invigorates the idea that economic inequality is based, and capital accumulation is based on relations that people have to the state. And Hegel proves this by saying, well, we use the same word, Stand, right? So then Marx actually in 1843 to 1844, in his critiques of Hegel, starts using the word Klasse, and says, okay, well, we're going to have this new word now. And they both get translated as class. Like Stand, when Marx writes, gets translated as class, and Klasse gets translated as class. And the reason I'm going through this kind of wonky point right here is because it invites us to think about the extent to which Marx is actually right about the eclipsing of our economic relations, the eclipsing of our status and our economic position based on our political status by our economic relations. And what I mean by that is that it is still the case in the United States, which is one of the most mobile countries in the history of the world, that 50 to 80% of inequality in wealth is based on intergenerational transmissions, and not the accumulation of income over your life. So Marx's theory is that under that Marx thinks, well, that's what it should look like under feudalism. And that's because feudalism maintains wealth through families. Whereas under capitalism, accumulation is supposed to be what he says is virginal, right? That each generation has its own thing, right? And so to the extent that our political institutions are still maintaining inequality based on family transmission of wealth, we actually, and then also through the nation, in the nation state, where you have more inequality among countries than within countries, then there's a disparity between a kind of leftist Marxist analysis of the source of economic inequality and what's actually going on. So it's not that there's no inequality based on capitalism, but it's just that there's a lot of other sources of inequality that don't come just from the relations to the means of production. And so when we think about the family, what is it that is behind that? So one response is like, well, we just have these natural intimacies and parents just want to pass on wealth to their families. But that's not actually what's going on. That might be responsible either for transmissions of wealth while people are alive, like you could give money to people you feel especially close to or with whom you're in proximity, but it doesn't explain inheritance, and it doesn't explain probate. So most people die without a will, first of all. Who takes care of that? Second of all, even when you have a will, it's not an individual decision or action that's transmitting the wealth. You need a state to do that, because you know what, if you're dead, you can't do anything, right? So there's something that we're doing with our political institutions that allow people to make these decisions about the disposition of their wealth after they're dead, as opposed to having wealth going into some kind of central repository or something to be distributed through our democratic institutions. And so I guess that's one point. Then within developing societies, inequality based on estates is actually much more dramatic than it is in the United States. So one economist at Berkeley estimates that 90% of inequality in the poorest countries is based on these estate or inheritance transmissions. So again, if you have this as the source of inequality, then just trying to address capitalism and a rhetoric or analysis of neoliberalism isn't going to be so helpful. What are the alternatives to trying to address that? I think part of it is just having this, being able to be a little bit more case-specific when we're talking about political inequality, and not just having these knee-jerk responses that pull off-the-shelf concepts to look at what's going on, but to have more granular and specific, contextual analysis of power. I think I'll just end with one observation, and we can talk together. But I think, to me, especially to say, moving to Chicago and moving to Illinois. And Chicago has the highest sales tax in the country. Illinois has the highest, the third highest property tax in the country. The public services here suck. Right? Like you take transportation, it's an insult, the way that this is all set up. The schools are terrible. So what's going on here? And it's not capitalism, right? I mean, partly it's greed. I think a lot of it's kleptocracy. And the ability of certain families and individuals through their networks to use money and influence and so forth through nonprofits in part, in order to affect the concentration of wealth. And I'll just close with one local example that has to do with my institution at Northwestern, which recently built a $150 million party house for the trustees on the shore of Lake Michigan, using a bond from the state of Illinois. And so, one question that we have to ask is, what is it that's impeding our ability as citizens to control that kind of wealth? And I don't think it's just capitalism. Part of it is there's a lot of obscurantism as far as the way that these financial instruments are set up and so forth. But part of it is, as activists and as scholars and as citizens, we need to be a little bit more attentive to the places where these abuses of power are occurring, and a little bit more active in trying to confront that. And having just a broad discourse of neoliberalism isn't so helpful to that.
All right, so now we're going to have each of you, for help set up, go into a 2 to 4 minute response to each other.
Yeah, and I love both concepts, which bring me to two very related issues from Ralph. And actually, both of you at the same time. I think it's not only the relationship to the means of production, but the relationship to the way in which wealth is accumulated and therefore distributed or not. And I can't avoid thinking about Lenin and the superior phase of capitalism is colonialism. Because everybody talks about the boom of the post-Second World War and the GI Bill, and everybody was able to buy a house and the industrial jobs, and nobody remembers that those were the times where Latin America was being spoiled and controlled and dismantled by the United States. And the wealth that was coming to the United States from Latin America was immense, incredible. And then the United States protected that right to bring wealth to the United States with supporting the coup d'etat against Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, and the dictatorship of Somoza, and as every other fruit in the world came to the United States from somewhere else, before California had water, etc. The point is, accumulation of wealth and where that wealth is coming from. I think that the state is protecting that wealth within certain national borders for its citizens, and doesn't want people from the colonies far away to come and share that wealth, even though that wealth belonged to them in the first place. But who cares? You know, you used to eat to eat bananas in Guatemala. Well, now your bananas are mine, and I don't want to give you my bananas. You know, because I bought them, I put the money to develop, you know, the plantations in Guatemala, and I don't want you Guatemalan to come here and eat those bananas. Period. That's it. And hence, you know, the regulation of labor force and deportations and the fortification of the borders. I think that the sovereign state means exactly that. I am protecting my wealth, whichever way I acquired it. I am protecting that wealth for my citizens, and that's it. Anyone else who wants to share that wealth, even if it's a poor peasant I made poor, you know, that guy's banned from enjoying this wealth. I think that's at the center of it. That's the beginning of nativism. You know, natives are here to protect natives. Only if you were born in the United States, you have the right. You know, don't allow anybody to come and enjoy our public benefits as we had at law. But basically, I think that's what is at the center. But our response has to do with the response not only to how that wealth was acquired, but what in the hell are we doing now as Mexicanos in the United States? You know, it's two separate issues. Okay, I blame you because you impoverished Mexico by bringing all the minerals and all the natural resources and all the everything here. I want a share of that. I am not going to move as an immigrant to a poorer country. I'm going to move to the wealthiest country, you know. It's obvious, I want some wealth. But then, once I'm here, what's my role here? What am I doing here? I'm not enjoying that wealth, you know. I'm just being part of the mechanism of, you know, I don't own the means of productions, I just want to work. So that's my role, and I want certain rights while I work. People are not, you know, I work a lot on stolen wages, and I tell the workers, when you think about money and how to earn money, you think about how many hours you're gonna work, you know. And when you're an employer and you think about money, what you think is, how am I going to extract another dollar from someone else? And that's the basic relationship we see here. You know, workers trying to work, and that's it. They know they are not going to be rich ever in the United States. There's no American dream for international workers, yeah, but they still want to work in peace and you know, be part of that big system of production. And what comes their way, they are going to share sending remittances to Mexico, and they are going to continue being poor. And that's what we try to stress with workers, you know. Regardless of your country, regardless of your immigration status, you are just pure working class. And that's it, and you have to unite and fight as part of the working class.
I don't have much to add. You know, towards Jackie, I agree with, I'm familiar with her arguments on inheritance, intergenerational accumulation, transfer of wealth. Piketty makes the same argument for France and England. This is why, for me, a term like the manuscript that I'm trying to finish right now that has part of its title, the oligarchic condition. And I think that a term like oligarchic, I mean, Russia has purebred oligarchs, but it seems to me that we have something that, we do have oligarchic figures, and I frankly wonder if the Clintons aren't that. Trump seems to be the same thing, which really becomes, I mean, what we're really at a face-off between two oligarchs, or two oligarchic families, or something or another. But so are the Jeb Bushes. So how many of the politicians that were running at one point or another kind of fall into almost those models of oligarchy? But broader than that, and more pernicious and insidious and difficult to figure out, is this larger system in which wealth and power are kind of linked together. So that's what I've tried to move away from oligarchy, which feels more like Eastern Europe or something, where I've also done field work, and you see it blatantly, to a more like oligarchic condition. Like somehow there is something pervasive that just kind of slips out there into the entire capillaries of the American system. But anyway, so I'm in full agreement with Jackie on that one. With Jorge, two things with Jorge. Jorge, I've known Jorge, actually Jorge may not remember me, but I've known Jorge for quite a number of years. But one of the things that I appreciate from the fieldwork perspective is that when you're dealing with real people, in this case workers, who are coming, they would never use the word neoliberal. If you were to say neoliberal, they don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Right.
So there's a strategy here if we want to understand a little deeper in terms of what's happening, at least from the workers' perspective. Kind of start with what the workers are saying and doing and how they conceive their worlds in some fashion or another, and kind of work up. And that's one of the reasons why I don't like the current overuse of the word neoliberal, because it's coming from it's coming from Harvey, it's coming from all of these post-Marxists, it's coming from top down in some fashion or another. And I think it would be better to kind of like dig in underneath. So here's a question I have for Jorge, which maybe at some point we can answer or talk a little bit about. I really am interested in Mexico, ejidos.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in NAFTA. I'm interested in how NAFTA entered into ejidos.
Right.
I'm interested in that change and the perceptions that the workers who moved up, who moved here, as a consequence, how they envisioned those relations. Not all of them were involved in ejidos, but of course, ejidos have deteriorated even further. Since that moment in time. But anyway, I'm kind of just interested in that very specific kind of question of a kind of old model of peasant socialism, and then suddenly thrown into the midst of property appropriations and displacement, land displacement.
So, see, what a response to Jorge has to do with your last point about the extent to which United States colonialism has this funny effect of then leading people to kind of want to double down. And I guess it raises a question about a parallel response, which is, from the Republican establishment and from big business, which is to want to have open borders.
I know.
And so the Wall Street Journal in 1984, and it run into what became the 1986 amnesty bill under the Reagan administration, proposed amending the United States Constitution by adding 5 words: "There shall be open borders." And its defense of this was in part economic, but it also put forward a pretty liberal defense of against wanting to have a 400-mile-long wall that would be the U.S. equivalent of the Berlin Wall, that might be, surrounded by attack dogs and machine guns, evoking this kind of, horror along the southern border, reminiscent of what was going on then in Berlin. So there's that going, as you know, like the 2007, 2008 Bush administration really tried to push through some kind of immigration reform, although it was really right-wing and terrible. Like, it wasn't reform, it was some change that made it worse for people. But this is this like funny situation where the reform itself was really bad for immigrants, and then it was defeated because it would be too good for immigrants. So these things are kind of complicated, and I just, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it, because I'm sure you thought about that a lot. And then the other, my thought in response to what Ralph is saying is I really want to read your next book. And then I'm just kind of curious about what you think about kleptocracy as a way of thinking of that. So the kleptocracy refers to just people stealing.
Yeah.
And oligarchy is that you have, a legal, aristocracy, where its wealth is protected through inheritance laws, and certain families are, picked out. Whereas in a kleptocracy, think about the Clintons, right? Like, these are people who are, using a nonprofit foundation to hide illegal kickbacks in exchange for representatives of Qatar and so forth being able to have access to the State Department in order to cut certain deals with the United States, or people who run weapons businesses being able to sell their weapons to Qatar in exchange for making sure that Northwestern sets up a campus there, which is done secretly. So there are these other kinds of arrangements that allow certain families to accumulate wealth. The Crown family, which has substantial holdings in General Dynamics and founded the weapons version of General Dynamics in the 1950s, is the 34th wealthiest family in the United States, and they live in Chicago. So, Boeing is based in Illinois, Caterpillar is based in Illinois, and that they're able to get certain kinds of benefits not because they're following the law, but because they're really good at breaking it.
You had a couple questions posed.
Yeah.
You want to respond?
Let me start by the last one, the kleptocracy. That's exactly what I deal with day in and day out. Just in Cook County alone, according to a study by the level program of UIC, $1.1 million are stolen a day from workers' wages. Now, $1.1 million may seem, like this tiny bit, 1.1, $380 million a year, not a whole lot. At the national level, it's $330 billion a year stolen from workers, and most of it from minimum wage workers. So you can, on top of earning minimum wage, you don't even get paid in full. And that contributes, that's a kleptocracy, because owners are given the chance, company owners are given the chance to accumulate wealth, to make a living, via stealing wages from workers. So the bottom line is not even at the bottom, it's like under, 3 levels down. So that's one very important thing to me. I think the crisis, the economic crisis, 2007-8 to 2015, pretty much, saw rampant kleptocracy. Families who were able to keep their business, maybe not become rich, but were able to keep their business via stealing from the poorest of the poor workers. Out of the millions of jobs that were lost in the crisis, I don't remember, like 67%, I think, were way up, way over minimum wage, and when they were recreated by 2014, 2015, they were recreated as minimum wage jobs. So you lost a job where you were earning $12 an hour, and the new job created 5 years later, to replace your job was a minimum wage job. So, it's lower in the scale. Now, the ejidos is an incredibly important and interesting question. The ejido was the communal property of land. And when NAFTA comes about, Mexico changes its constitution to allow those communities to sell those lands. So the destruction of the ejido, the destruction of the communal land, because the communal land couldn't be sold before. It belonged to the community, to certain agricultural communities, and it was absolutely forbidden to sell or trade or anything. That land belonged to the whole town. But constitutional changes allow, after NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, allow for the sale and buy of those communal lands. So they become private property. And most of them become the property of large corporations, US corporations, the Green Giant and, well, Connected Jacks, it's not US, but, international corporations buying that land which used to be communal land. And therefore the displacement of the owners of that land, each one of the people in the community worked a piece of land but now you don't have anything to work on because the land is not yours anymore, it's not communities anymore. But there's a middle step. I mean, that causes a displacement that ends up in the United States, but there's a middle step, and that's the Maquila program. Because most of the displaced workers from the agriculture in Mexico end up in the Maquila, in the twin plants program in the border, yeah, and they were there for several years until they realized that if they just cross the line and move 200 yards north, they are going to be earning 6 times what they are earning at any maquiladora plant. You know, and maquiladoras are not any good deal for Mexico, and that comes from like the 70s or the beginning of the 80s, you know, where you are paying $6 an hour here, but you move 200 yards south, and you only have to pay 40 cents an hour. That's it. So the maquilas create this big labor market in Mexico. But when people displaced from the agriculture, from the former ejidos, learn that in the maquiladora, you know, life is not worth living because 200 yards to the north, you're going to be making 6 times more. People start crossing the border and crossing the border and crossing the border. And then that's the Bill Clinton Operation Gatekeeper program kicks in, and et cetera, et cetera. That's why I say immigration is the most complicated thing I know in the world. You know, basically, the Hillary Clinton is paying for her deeds. You know, as Secretary of State, she supported the coup d'etat in Honduras, and then 6 years down the road, 50,000 kids, minors from Honduras and El Salvador show up in the border. You know, that's a consequence of the international policies of the United States. That's part of the debate in immigration. We are trying to firmly and strongly separate national security from immigration. Immigration is a natural movement of people looking for improvement and wealth, yeah, and border security and national security is an issue depending on international policies of the United States. It's not related to immigration, you know, it's not related. I mean, this tiny bit, but it's not related to workers trying to work in the United States. This is completely separate issues. I mean, we could talk on this for years, but...
So we'll take some questions. Can I have a show of hands real quick? Anybody have questions? Do you have a question? I'm going to ask one more. We'll see how quick it is. And it's going to be difficult because it's going to be, I'm going to try to aim it as much to 3 of you as possible. So Jorge, you sort of evoked Lenin tonight on the 99th anniversary of Petrograd Soviet. And for Lenin, as my understanding would go, for the Second International radicals, there is an understanding of capitalism as something that is constituted by working class organization. And that the left in its organization is something that provokes capitalism into, gives it an acuity that it would not have automatically otherwise. That imperialism is a heightened state of capitalism precisely because, and a change from earlier mid-19th century capitalism, precisely because there is a working class making demands upon it. And this is all sort of preface to perhaps to push back to the question of neoliberalism as a category. I find that neoliberalism as a category is something that tries to deal with capitalism in the latter half of the 20th into our present time, and deal with it in a way that I think is useful in as much as it provokes an understanding of the symptomology of the decay of the left. In other words, the decay of politics has something to do with the need for understanding a change in capitalism in the last half of the 20th century. And so like all this, as I'm glad this came up in the opening remarks, is to say what happened, what is capitalism and how has it changed? And what does it mean for us politically? And I'm interested, I mean, especially since, Ralph, you've brought up the issue of starting with the self-understanding of these workers, these people that Jorge has defined specifically as international workers, despite the fact that they may not identify as such. And in particular, I'm interested in how each of you would understand, in the context of US politics, what it means and for a left political struggle, that the problem of international immigration has been racialized in the United States, that Latinos have become a race and have functioned as such in the Democratic Party, continue to function as actually modeled off or essentially racialized politics that this country has sort of that's specific to this country in a way that it is not. I mean, this comes up, of course, in discourse about like, well, like these Mexicans are coming here, and you have to like step to the side and say, well, they're not all Mexicans, first of all. But it is this sort of like racialized category that is problematic, and the tendency towards a sort of racialized nationalistic identity politics, which goes hand in hand with a lot of these descriptions of neoliberalism, is problematic for the left and what it tries to pursue in leading the working class towards some sort of politics outside of what we would understand to be the Democratic Party politics of, essentially the sort of machine politics that we're familiar with from the early 20th century, the late 19th century, really. So I was like, perhaps if each of you could flesh out a bit how you understand that in relation to the issue of how capitalism has changed. And if anybody wants to start.
Well, maybe 1 minute each. I think neoliberalism, I think, is not a kind of production system. It's a policy. It's how do you organize production worldwide. Instead of deciding the South is agriculture and the North is industrial, to oversimplify, is okay, steel is going to be produced by Sweden and China, and the United States is going to produce services. That's neoliberalism, and with all its consequences. It's a new world order. That's pretty much it. Decided by oligarchies and national governments of the big industrial consortiums and whatnot. Indeed, there's no Latinos outside the United States. Outside the United States, we are Mexicanos and Salvadoreños and Brasileños, and you never identify as a Latino Chicanos even. But there are no Latinos outside the United States. But that thing, that's an incredible tradition that has to do with the famous theory of the melting pot. Once you made it to the United States, you became American. Even if that's the name of the whole continent. Yeah. You became American, and that's it. You forgot about your language, your cultures, your whatever. Bullshit. This city was divided between Italians and Poles, and then the Irish came about, and then you have to share a little bit with the Irish, and that's a real history. But the popular culture is that of the melting pot. Yeah, everybody, just dissolved here and was created anew as an American. And that's something we have been trying to combat. And I bring it about because part of the so-called immigration movement is working precisely on the theory of proving that Mexicans are not Mexicans anymore. They can forget about being Mexicans, and they can integrate into the system. They can integrate into the society. They can learn English, and they can become Americans. So it's the melting pot theory, and we keep insisting on the theory of the salad. Yeah, all of us are in the same bowl, but some of us are carrots, and some are lettuce, and excuse you me, but we are not exactly the same. We make a pretty good dish, yeah, but each one of us with our own national, cultural, blah, 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 whatever characteristics and culture and inheritance and et cetera, et cetera. So, I think.
Yeah, the issue of race is really complicated, and it's one that I have, frankly, my head just keeps always turning and twisting and never quite figuring it, never quite actually trying to avoid the issue because I find it so entangled. Some of the most dangerous folks that we can talk about in relationship to this are wealthy Mexicans.
Right.
Talk about kleptocracy. They're not racialized, they're cosmopolitans. It's the worker that gets racialized. Is it a worker? So then what's race as it gets meshed with these kinds of class sorts of issues? Who are the Trump supporters? That's another kind of interesting question. Why are they supporting essentially an oligarch? Are they all workers? They fear neoliberalism. They don't want it in the same way that the left doesn't want it. One of the things that's always gotten me in trouble in Latin American Latino studies is that when we look at places that are deporting people or expelling people, one of the worst cases right now is the Dominican Republic and their fear of Haitians. Now, that has a long racialized histories, long class histories. The Dominican Republic, or Dominican Republicans, all the baseball players are black. But the leadership has thought of itself as European, and the Haitians as African. But you can go to Africa and you can see populations or states that are deporting neighboring states. Nigeria, I believe, is in the game of deportation right now with some of its neighbors, and so on. Brexit is interesting. They wanted to get rid of Hungarians and Poles and Romanians, among others. So I get all confused, to be honest, with the racial issue. It appears, it's used, obviously, it hooks itself onto all kinds of things which are not innately racialized, but it hooks itself onto that. But in other, in other areas it doesn't. Frankly, trying to think about it globally, not in the U.S. In U.S. terms, yes, there is racialization of Mexicans, let's say, racialization, but not of poor Mexicans. Racialization of poor Puerto Ricans, but not wealthy Puerto Ricans. And same thing with Latin Americans.
So just following up on what Ralph said, which I really agree with, the deportation machine in this country would grind to a halt without native Spanish speakers. Right, so the people who are kind of on the front line and who are taking a lot of the jobs,
Right.
Organizing the deportation, are native Spanish speakers. And, I mean, seriously, it would be a big problem if there were no Spanish spoken by the people who are trying to kick people out. Like, it would just really stop. So that's one thought. In terms of the question about neoliberalism and what some people find helpful about it, you said, I think maybe you can correct me if I'm mischaracterizing it, but it helps identify a pattern of capitalism in the late 20th, early 21st centuries. But so I feel like it's just the left waving a white flag. Like it's kind of like, oh, it's all too confusing, it's overwhelming, they won, but we don't know what to do, we're confused. As opposed to the as opposed to thinking seriously about the resources that we still have within the liberal institutions and seeing what we can do as the left to mobilize those. I mean, this isn't Russia, this isn't Egypt. There are, we have elections, we have, courts, and there are ways of being creative and using those. And so, if you just say, well, everything's neoliberal, then it sounds like it's all this totalizing, monopoly of the rich people who just shut us out and are using their values and that they win. So that's why I think it's disempowering.
On that notion, I had a question about sort of the politics of the present moment. And so what 2016 presented itself as is sort of a renewed polarization of politics in America between something that becomes more identifiable as the left, represented by Sanders, and as the right, represented by Clinton. And now sort of the question would be, is Trump running to the left of Clinton on some issues? The reason I ask this is, so some of the revelations of Clinton speaking to bankers about open borders, right? That's one of the frustrations that certainly Trump taps into. But if we think seriously about it, also Sanders in a way, because if you call for a renewed emphasis in the welfare state, on renewed investment in public infrastructure and production of jobs, doesn't that call for a stronger state as it presented itself in Fordism and Keynesianism as sort of a central planning agency, one that, if it produces enough growth, can pass this on to workers through the form of welfare measures and so forth. And on the other hand, you have neoliberalism, I will just use that term, undoing these centralized mechanisms, planning mechanisms, and thus also threatening, redistributive measures. Right, and I think that's sort of what left and right presents itself as today. So is it the case that the left, and that of course then has ramifications on immigration. So is it the case then that the left today wants stronger borders and a more centralized state, and the right wants to liberalize international mobility, migration, and what does that mean for us politically? Does that just mean that actually Sanders is totally on the right of the political spectrum, or because I think that's where a lot of the confusion stems from presently, and I wonder how you think about this present moment and about this renewed polarization of American politics in this context.
I mean, I don't know if you guys heard Michael Moore on behalf of Donald Trump. So it is this, I heard him on right-wing radio.
Because they play that clip, right?
Glenn Beck has also come out for Hillary. In 2016.
Yeah. So, what was I gonna do? Right. I guess your question goes to in a couple directions. So one response is, Sanders almost was the president, because presumably if he had won the Democratic nomination,
Right.
he would be beating Trump. And so on the one hand, we're on this precipice of something terrible no matter what happens on Tuesday, right? Like either one of them will win. There's no good alternative, right? But it could have been really different. First of all, and then second of all, Obama won not as a neoliberal, like he won as keep hope alive, and he lied. It was like a big bait and switch. I think we have to be open to there being a lot of different kinds of possibilities, and on the one hand, seeing your point that they both are really grim in our current moment, but on the other hand, seeing that is just one cut at what is going on, and that there's a lot of other kinds, like a whole other range of political attitudes.
A way of putting a finer point on your question would be the neoliberal thinkers who didn't think of themselves as neoliberal, but liberal, like Hayek and Friedman, they considered themselves utopian as opposed to what they saw sort of as a totalitarian state, right? So they did conceive of their own project as a utopian project. So there is some sort of political component there that we need to take seriously that harkens back to the bourgeois tradition that Marx celebrates in the Communist Manifesto. It produces potentially a world society. It allows for international migration. It allows for an international consciousness. And yet, if you're on the left today, what are we calling for? We're calling for sort of stronger welfare state and so forth. So isn't sort of the left undercutting the utopian potential of liberalism and capitalism?
I just want to say one more quick thing about this. Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really great question. And I ultimately really endorse very strongly a real liberal agenda and citizenship. And so, I think one way of articulating what you're talking about is that rather than look to have certain kinds of institutions, like we want to have more public institutions, or we want to have like this or that, to think about what it means to cultivate the population as citizens, including people like, regardless of what their legal status is and so forth, that like, everybody is a citizen. And what Aristotle means by that is that you partake in the administration of justice. And so if we can, kind of have a more robust understanding of who we are, then that, kind of puts to the margins the question of whether the Chicago public schools have more or less money. Because even if they have more money, it's not just charter schools that it goes to, but the person who's running it was convicted of stealing, right? Mm-hmm. So, kickbacks and so forth. So it's not just, you can have, after the revolution, you can have these public institutions and the distribution of wealth. It doesn't mean it's going to solve the problem. What does seem like a better bulwark against that is to cultivate citizenship.
And that's the most contentious point in the immigration reform movement. Also, on the left, at least, strongly believe that the famous invention of the path to citizenship was just a political trap. 80 to 87% of all immigrants who naturalize U.S. citizens and vote for the Democratic Party. When you put forward an immigration proposal that not only includes, but practically it starts with the path to citizenship, you are telling Republicans, let's legalize 10 million people and 8.7 million are going to vote for me. Right, so what's the Republican response? Fuck you. Of course not. I mean, in what mind is going to be, yeah, I'm going to give you 8.7 million more votes? Are you nuts? It was a game. It was a pure game, because then the Democratic Party gets to accuse the Republicans of not getting on line with immigration reform. And Obama keeps deporting people on one side and calling the Republicans to vote in favor of an immigration reform that they know it's political suicide. How are they going to give 8.7 million more votes to the Democratic Party? That would end, effectively, the gerrymandering the Republicans have been building in the last two censuses and redistricting, to have the majority in the House. The Senate is another animal, but the House is firmly, strongly in the Republican hands because of the drawing of the electoral districts. That's real politics. That's real politics. So I want everybody to be a citizen, or I don't want anybody to be a citizen, because to me it's meaningless from the point of view of, not me Jorge Mujica, but from the point of view of the immigrant, in this country. I don't give a damn about citizenship. Citizenship is good to bring my parents, to bring my brothers, because only citizens, U.S. citizens, can petition their brothers and sisters. That's it. If you're not a citizen, you can't petition them. So you have to become a citizen in order to petition them. Second, because when I retire, I want to go back to Mexico and receive my pension in Mexico. And if I am a legal permanent resident, I cannot do that. Because if I'm absent from the United States for more than 6 months, I lose my residency and I lose my benefits, and I don't want that. So I become a U.S. citizen. Voting between Republicans and Democrats? Are you crazy? That's exactly the same thing we went through for 80 years in Mexico, where we only had the Revolutionary Institutional Party and the National Action Party, the center and the right. Those were our options. We fought against that for decades. And then we are here and people tell us that we have to become citizens to vote either Democrat or Republican. Go to hell! I don't want to be a citizen. I don't want to be part of that thing. You know, so what have we been doing? Vote green, vote green, vote green, vote green. Why? Not because we believe in Jill Stein and not because, you know, honest. But because we think if the Green Party here in Illinois becomes a registered party, then, you know, there may be the chance of more electoral opportunities. And not that we believe that elections are going to solve problems. If they did, we wouldn't have any problem, because we have elections every 2 years, you know, so there wouldn't be problems in the world. But, you know, we know it's not. But part of the game, political game on the ground, is to have some kind of participation in election processes if we think we can get some kind of advantage from that. Otherwise, get it. You know, my prediction, Clinton's going to win like with more than 300 electoral votes, and then she's going to negotiate with the Republicans, and it's going to be Bill Clinton all over again. You know, Bill Clinton is going to be the first gentleman in the White House, but it's going to be a repeat. You know, Republicans delivering the platform to Hillary, and Hillary signing off. So go back to 1994. That's the perspective, I think. Oh, I'm sorry. One difference between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans are liberal in the sense that the less regulated market, the better. Let's eliminate minimum wage, and let's leave it, you know, up to the forces of the workers against the employers. Yeah, that's what Trump is basically proposing, you know. Let's get rid of all government regulations, and let's just the market regulate itself and whatever. Democrats, I think, are this tiny bit more intelligent, and they say there's going to be explosions, social explosions, if we don't regulate some, you know, and that's, I think, the origin and the end of Obamacare. You know, we have a real crisis, and before it is unmanageable, let's try to manage it. And they could, but Hillary Clinton, I'm sure she's willing to negotiate with the Republicans Obamacare reform. She's going to do it. You know, what Republicans have been asking for, you know, let's redo Obamacare. I think Hillary is going to give it to them. Absolutely. You know, regulation, but, you know, sensible regulation.
Anything else?
No, it's more interesting. Others and their questions.
More questions?
Well, I guess like two things. Sorry for the bow, first of all, going back over, but if a lot of people are like despairing about the election, but you also have to appreciate just how like crazy all of this is, and how the endorsements from various people have sort of shaken out. It's it's obviously a very unique moment politically in a lot of ways. So I guess like maybe two kind of questions, like one sort of shorter one directed mostly at Jorge, and then one just sort of in general. Like I want to kind of go back to the question of what was sort of raised in the opening remarks about, well, we talked about like neoliberalism and like how we try to like understand the present and kind of like recent changes, but also like kind of the question of like, do we still live under capitalism, or is it like kleptocracy, and are those two different things? And I mean, not just in the sort of purely just like understanding it, but like practically, what are the kind of like effects of that? Like, do we live? People obviously, the vast majority of people still have to sell their labor, sell themselves as workers to make a living. On the other hand, a lot of the things that one would generally think of as like being part of capitalism, or at least certainly like, you know, like part of, you know, bourgeois society or commercial society, don't seem to exist, or like not in the same way, or they've been very much changed, and like how much of that has to do with just sort of like political dysfunction, or just sort of like, you know, how do we kind of account for that? And then the more kind of just, and that's for all the panelists, And then I guess the more like direct question is like, Jorge, you brought up the like idea of like melting pot versus like a kind of more like a toss out or like an assemblage, right? And I mean, what was interesting about that is, you know, in light of like some of your earlier comments, is that I obviously like I don't expect that you are like you know, really anyone trying to organize is going to like tell people they like have to give up, you know, anything about their how they identify in terms of their ancestry or other things that matter to them culturally. But you are asking them to draw like their first political conclusions or the most important political conclusions from the fact that they're all workers, from the fact that they do in fact share this bowl, they share something in common, and not to draw like, or not to, you know, or to sort of to subordinate any other political conclusions they would draw perhaps from, you know, like, well, you know, like I'm from this country, like we have this like bad blood, like not to let that to interfere with the fact that they have a shared common interest as workers. You're asking them, you're trying to politically organize them on that basis. So like how sort of do you sort of articulate between those two things, or sort of, yeah, that would be my.
It's really not complicated. Workers really identify pretty well the Colombian guy working next to you on the line and the Colombian guy in the office. The Colombian guy in the office comes from the white families in Colombia, you know, whether they were narcos or not, but families with money who came to study in the university, studied business administration. He's a graduate and he works in the office. And the other Colombian guy who was displaced by the drug wars and lost his land and lost his family and came as a refugee, yeah, that's the guy working next to me. And they both are Colombian and I'm Mexican. And I am not the Mexican in the office or the bilingual immigration border patrol Mexican-American guy, you know. No, I'm the Mexican peasant displaced from the Ejido and then worked in the maquiladora and then ended up here without papers. And people identify each other on the line, you know, and they are pretty clear on the other guys. They may be Latinos, they may be Mexicanos, they may be Colombians, but they are not us. And that's very clear. There's no doubt whatsoever in that sense. And again, one of the most beautiful struggles I participate in is the Fight for 15. And in the Fight for 15, there is the consigna, how do you say consigna in English?
Consigna.
La orden, the directive. The directive. If you are African American, because 50% of the workers are African American and 50% Latino in the city. You go to a McDonald's far out in the suburbs and yeah, you find white workers. But here in the city, 50% are Latinos and the other 50% are African Americans. So the directive is, you're African American, you pick a sign in Spanish. You're Latino, you pick a sign in English. And you chant in English. And if you're African American, you chant in Spanish. And you go to the rallies in the Fight for 15, and it's the most fantastic thing. The undocumented Latina worker, yeah, and the citizen by birth African American worker together chanting, you know, in a crossover fashion and holding crossover language signs. They are workers. Who gives a damn about anything else? Race, citizenship status, language, and I don't know what. We are deleting that barrier, and it's beautiful to see that.
What was the first part of your question?
So yeah, just sort of in terms of different ways of trying to understand like the present and sort of recent changes, like going back to sort of the question of like, do we live under capitalism? Do we live under like sort of kleptocracy or oligarchy? Are those actually mutually exclusive things? Yeah.
I meet, the fact that if I weren't here, well, last week, Monday night at this time, and next week, Monday night, at this time. There's a small working group that I belong to. It includes a libertarian economist who believes in many of the sorts of, well, certainly free trade and all of those sorts of things. And then there are three others who are more left-leaning. And we have just really interesting conversations. We have been trying to figure out, and we haven't gotten very far, but we have been trying to figure out, because all the parties involved are interested in a capitalism which is not presently in place. Even the libertarian economist is interested in capitalism that's not in place. So we sit there and we read different things, maybe anthropology, economic anthropology, traditional Austrian, sort of stuff, stuff that doesn't even quite agree with Hayek, or actually agrees with Hayek, may not agree with von Mises. Stuff like that tries to split and divide. Other folks who are of that same right-wing variety don't particularly care for Milton Friedman. Personally, I think Milton Friedman is mediocre, but Hayek is fantastic as a thinker because he gives you some very solid arguments. Milton Friedman, to me, I don't know how to read Milton Friedman's actual economic stuff. I mean, monetary policy, I can't quite do that. But I can certainly read his popular stuff, and he's never struck me as a particularly interesting thinker. But Hayek has always been, for me, a very interesting thinker. Von Mises, the same thing, some of the Austrians as well. Anyway, the point is that here's a group of left-leaning people, right-leaning people, and we've really been trying to figure out, what would an economy look like that's doesn't have the profile of capitalism as it does today. It's interesting, obviously, different voices coming from different perspectives. We can't arrive at a consensus. I keep arguing for a commons, a deep sense of the commons, which, by the way, I would argue is not derivable from the current left, which wants to believe in social action and social change. Now, maybe that sounds strange, but it seems to me that social action and social change imply that the marginalized get something, but somebody else is going to have to give up something else. So that does not become a kind of commons. And personally, I've been thinking of commons almost coming out of the phenomenological tradition. So that's a different sort of thing there that I've been trying to argue for. But I do think, I think ultimately this is the argument that I've made over and over and over and over, that for a truly radical left to appear and to have any kind of traction, you cannot divorce it from the current conditions of resources in some fashion. I'll just give you a quick example. In economic anthropology, if you have a nomadic people, they believe in property rights, also communal rights, but if they are nomadic, they cannot afford to acquire because you have to move. So you don't acquire. Obviously, our society permits tremendous amount of acquisition, and you stay in place. But if you have a crisis which really breaks apart those senses of, or that sense of resource management by which everyone survives, if you have something that literally breaks that apart, and of course, one thing that we can think about is enormous climate change. We can think about climate refugees, economic refugees who are being displaced from Bangladesh, which will be one of the major sites. Well, then something has begun to collapse. You know, some world order, some world arrangement has begun to collapse. You're going to have to invent an economic system to begin to readjust your lenses. So that's what I'm trying to talk about. Eventually, it's this world that we inhabit. And where is this world that we are inhabiting in terms of natural resources and so on and so on? Where is it headed? And something like that will begin to drive reinventions, perhaps, of economies. A lot of, the scenarios may be a tremendous amount of debt, so who knows what it would be. But at the moment, I don't see anything really emerging from the left or from the right that really understands at a deep level the intimate relation between economic systems and management of the resources that are actually available around us. Does that make sense?
I'll try to be brief. So, I think I want to respond to this question by engaging a bit more with what Jorge was saying about the irrelevance of citizenship. Because I think that, so there's two different ways of thinking about citizenship. One is active citizenship and the other is passive citizenship. And I think what Jorge is talking about is passive citizenship. Like, who cares if you have these nominal rights to be a member in this particular way and be able to vote? That's based on your political status. I mean, it might matter if you want to go back and forth or bring family members in or something like that. And, to get at your question about what the right way is to think about the current system and an alternative, suggests that if we get the procedures right and the institutions right, our work is done. Whereas I think one of the lessons is that if you can get any institution you want in place, and if you have the people running it operating in bad faith, it doesn't matter what the rules are, right? And it doesn't matter how smart your analysis is of the right alternative. And so that's why I'm kind of turning to this idea of robust citizenship, so that the people who occupy our current or alternative institutions, like they're us, and that we are bringing to them a certain set of values and commitments and integrity and so forth that are not what we see right now. And just to give one quick example, so I'm doing some research on immigration judge misconduct, and one of the things that we notice, I'm doing this with Professor Heather Schoenfeld and Elizabeth Meehan, who is a student at Northwestern, Professor Schoenfeld's obviously a professor. And one of the things that we found is that most of the misconduct is committed by a handful of bad immigration judges. And that's also similar to the findings in Chicago police misconduct. So it can't be that the procedures are terrible, or it would be much more evenly distributed. And so, in terms of trying to analyze what's going on, we came up with typologies of bad actors. And so the bully, the accountant, the thief, the crony, and the idiot. Where, those
among
kind
judges?
among the immigration judges.
Yeah.
So, like, the idiot is, Richard Posner is on the Seventh Circuit, and he sends a complaint saying, this opinion by an immigration judge is written in no known language. And it's true. Anyway, so I guess that's what might be another way of the left trying to engage with our current political institutions is to say, okay, well, maybe we had the revolution. These are rules that are good enough. What would it look like to try to change the kinds of outcomes that we have within what we have.
I mean, I agree. That's sort of big issue, you know, the meaning, the real meaning of citizenship. And I have to tell you, I agree with Trump. The system is rigged. But I read from the Constitution. You know, for 250 years, the system has been rigged. The system is not broken. The system is designed that way. You know, the system is designed that way. Why do you believe, if you remember, an African American, a black slave was only 4/5 of a human being? Because of vote counting in the South. You know, if they gave full recognition as full human beings and citizens to all blacks in the South, they were going to overwhelm the white populations in the South. 1938, why the labor law does not recognize domestic workers as workers or domestic companions, family companions. Why? Because domestic servants were black in the South, and they were thousands upon thousands. So let's not recognize them, and let's not recognize agricultural workers in the labor laws either. Why? Because we have a bunch of blacks and we have a bunch of Mexicanos, you know, working in the fields, and we don't want to recognize them as workers. Let's recognize them as something else. The system is designed.
But when you say the system, like what is the system?
Well, I do believe that, you know, there are meetings like this, but with people with billions and billions of dollars and huge degrees who think about 2020 and 2025 and 2030 and 2040, and they plan, and they have the money to actually do it. I do believe that. It's not conspiracy theory. I mean, I think they do it. They do it that way.
But they lose a lot too. I mean, the Koch brothers like lost a lot of things.
No doubt. No doubt. But again, you have a system that says every 10 years upon the results of the US Census, you are going to redistrict, remap, you know, but then they allow gerrymandering all over. I ran in the election in 2009, I think, for Congress, out of fun and to give a step, you know, the immigration movement in the electoral arena. Well, comes 2010, the census, 2011, the redistricting, my house got cut off from the 3rd district, my house. Yeah, 1 block north, 1 block south, 1 block east. And boom, you know, I got, this crazy immigrant got 24% of votes against Lipinski. What happened in the redistricting? All those areas cut him off and give them to Luis Gutierrez. You know? Yeah, deal with the immigration problem, Luis, that's your problem. So they safeguard this blue dog Democrat. So a system that allows gerrymandering to that, you know, block by block and alley by alley and house by house, it's by design. That's not a, you know, casual. That's the way the system is being created.
But there's also been challenges to gerrymandering that have prevailed, and so I'm curious, like if you'd gone to court and said that there's no rational basis for this, they're discriminating against me, they picked me out, it's illegal.
Mexican,
what would that would be an interesting, that would have been a great way to, at worst,
Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Forum, they went to court, they challenged. The judge,
on the basis of your...
No, not mine. It was the previous, the 1990 census results and redistricting. Comes out the verdict from the court, from the judge, saying, well, yeah, you're right, there's a lot of Latinos in this area, but they are minors. And the US Constitution defends and protects the rights of citizens regarding elections. So only 18 years and all US citizens count for the districting. And you know, you have a bunch of kids, but they are under 18. And then you have a bunch of legal residents, which don't vote. And then you have a bunch of undocumented people, they don't vote. So the gerrymandering is right, and it's correct, legally.
So we're gonna, we're gonna take a last question. Any other questions? I've from Gregory wanted to ask another one. All right, we're gonna have the last question and then allow it to fold into your closing remarks, unfortunately. We're going to.
Yeah, so I wanted to sort of, I kind of know where you stand, Jorge, in terms of politics. I would guess that as a socialist you would say, well, workers need to take power. So I wonder about the two professors on the panel who have in a way avoided some of the more political questions. So Professor Stevens, if sort of your notion of citizenship, I wonder, who counts? So the traditional Marxist conception was, well, world citizenship, international society, global society, and on that basis you would organize a political party. So are these sorts of notions that you find interesting, that you find politically possible? Because you've been talking about your field work, about your own academic work, but politically, do you see sort of, if we grant sort of the existence of some sort of system named capitalism in which elites have power, the working class would have to find ways to, have power itself. Is that a form of politics in a traditional Marxist sense that you find valid, or how do you think of politics with regard to capitalism today?
Well, I don't think that talking about empowering citizens to be more active in controlling government is not political. I mean, this idea that there's, there definitely are these groups of guys and women who are sitting around
Sure.
and are really well funded, who are making these plans, but they don't always win. And there are a lot of other, people who are sitting around in rooms and organizing and, win lawsuits and, put up some bulwarks. And so I don't think that it's, it's not as far along as we would like. So I guess, yeah, I mean, I guess it would be, I'm going to now quote from Yoko Ono. We have to use our intelligence to defeat theirs. And, especially because of the internet and other kinds of lowering of the barriers to communication and sharing information and organizing, it actually really changes the playing field in terms of organizing among the left, so that people can meet on Skype, or even plane tickets are cheaper. You can get access to information from archives online that you used to have to travel places to. You can do FOIA requests and get access to government documents that used to require just like incredibly labor-intensive research that only very wealthy foundations would be willing to fund, or if you weren't already rich. So I think that those kinds of changes provide some kinds of possibilities.
Yeah, my politics. This last book that published, the thesis there was that the trope of revolution has had its day, and it's been replaced by in terms of social change, the trope of revolution has had its day. And I think it's been replaced by the trope of catastrophe, quite frankly, and its material resources or material conditions have a stronger sense now of what's driving things. I mean, even when you looked at the Egyptian, it was driven by an oligarchy, the military, and Mubarak had managed to sell ownership of major businesses, etc., to the military. So almost all of the revolutions that we have seen recently will either be undermined by larger political forces. For instance, if something should happen in Saudi Arabia, well, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? We could, NATO will not allow the Saudi Arabian thing to be overturned. We'll put an end to that in some fashion. So it's not that the wind behind the sails of revolution has necessarily ended, but we have very strong international political powers that are jostling in order to maintain these sorts of things. But if you have catastrophes, and even some of them don't really work either, nothing's, is anything going to change Haiti? Let's put an earthquake on top of Haiti tomorrow, which on top of a hurricane, on top of deportation from Dominican Republic. Well, let's have another earthquake
Withdrawal of citizenship.
next year.
All right.
And let's have that. A Zika. You know, there are places where not having catastrophe is going to, you know, change things. So, but I do think that we have to start thinking more about material conditions as driving forces of social change and what sorts of alterations might be out there. Dramatic, sharp alterations might be, you know, out there on the horizon. And it's not as if things like the French Revolution, for instance, or even the Communist Revolution, those are being driven by very strong material changes, you know, as well. So whatever it is that revolution, I guess there's an idealization about the trope of revolution. Now, maybe you weren't asking that question at all, so, you know, that's just me jumping kind of on the bandwagon. To become normal, and I'll try to do this really quickly, I do believe in a global politics of some sort. I do believe that we need to think in more and more and more about politics of movement of peoples. I think we need to challenge more and more politics of the stability of nation states, even though nation states certainly provide so many benefits, et cetera, a kind of basic survival that none of us are very quickly want to give up, even though we may pride ourselves on our radical sensibilities or whatever. But in the long run, I think we have to rethink conceptualizations of the nation state towards a broader global politics. For sure, economies would be part of that, you know, part of that imaginary in some fashion. And that's about as far as I would go, because that's such a tough question.
Let me talk about the role of the left and its failure, I think, somehow. I started working for this worker center at Rice, Chicago 4 years ago, 4.5 or something like that. In those 4 years, we have passed an ordinance against stolen wages in the city of Chicago that says that if you steal wages, you may lose your business license. So it's a deterrent. One in the Cook County who says if you have a history of stolen wages, you won't receive any tax breaks. You know, because the county gives tax breaks for everything, for being by the river, for being by the water, for creating tax cuts for everything. So, well, if you have a history of stolen wages, you won't get any tax cut. We passed minimum wage in the city of Chicago, as shitty as it is. Today is $10.50. You know, 2 years ago it was $8.25, and that's a significant chunk like this for minimum wage workers. We passed an ordinance for minimum wage in Cook County, which is going to kick on July 1st, 2017, increasing to $10 an hour in the whole Cook County. We passed earned sick time in the city of Chicago, up to 5 years paid sick time, absences from work in the city of Chicago, and then the same in the Cook County. We passed at the state level the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. They are recognized as workers, they earn minimum wage, they are entitled to overtime, and they are entitled to weekly rest. And we passed another one which we don't even talk about many times, but the Department of Labor, whenever recovered salaries under the Rauner administration, which is not that very often, but whenever they recovered salaries, they passed the money on to the controller, and the controller issued the checks to the workers. Except that the controller was using E-Verify, you know, and requesting social security numbers from workers. And that was no. So we you know, launched a drive, a legislation, and now the Department of Labor keeps the money in a special fund, and the Department of Labor gives the money to the workers without ever asking for social security numbers. What's the problem with this picture? That the left doesn't figure in all of this in a public way. This is all the work of nonprofits, of allies, of community, social justice this and social justice that, including my organization. And the left is behind all of these organizations and all behind these drives. But never, ever, anybody says, yeah, we the left contributed to the minimum wage. We the left did this. We the left proposed that legislation. We the left blah, blah, blah. If we did, we would be criticized as reformists. Because, oh yeah, sure, minimum wage increase. Yeah, but I think if we did, we would change the conversation about the left, which is somehow what Sanders started doing in his campaign. It's the same thing on immigration. I mean, all these things I have pointed out have benefited immigrant workers. Yeah, most undocumented workers. Minimum wage increase, that's what an immigrant undocumented worker got. But the left doesn't figure in the picture. And I think it's high time that the left comes forward and says, yeah, I'm a socialist. I'm a worker organizer and I'm a socialist. So what? Kill me. The left today is also the anniversary of the Palmer deportations. When they deported every Italian, from pink to red, it was deported from the United States. 1927, before Sacco and Vanzetti and all that stuff. The left was out there, public, holding meetings in 20 languages. Yeah, the Communist Party had 20 different cells in the same workplace because there were people from 20 nationalities speaking 20 languages. The left today is not doing that. If you don't speak English, the left can go to you and talk to you, unfortunately. We had a tradition in the European communities of being multilingual. We have lost that, in the melting pot. We lost all those native languages and cultural, etc. So we need people bilingual and trilingual. I hired immediately anybody who speaks Spanish, Polish, and English. Yeah, I would love that. And if somebody who wants to translate into Korean, our workers' rights manual, talk to me because we need it. Because 60% of Koreans living in Swedish have our own government. On the left, 60%. That's what the Korean Center says. Go believe it, but I do believe. So that's a real reality, and that's what I think the left is missing. To be out there, present in the public view. To me, it's like I don't know. The U.S. left still has a hangover from McCarthy, but McCarthy died 60 years ago. Come on. What, you're going to lose your job? Give me a break. You're going to lose your job because whatever. Because your boss, is a White Sox fan and you're celebrating the job. You don't need an excuse to fire anybody. So be bold, and come up and say, yeah, I'm left and so what? And I'm driving these reforms, but at least let people know this is the left. Okay.
I want to thank our speakers. And we're all going to go to Jake's tap for a drink.